Mayor Benjamin, ready to rock and roll? Trying to figure out, did you guys get in trouble? They've sent you down to the other end of the table, and everybody was together, but then Mayor Benjamin was down at one end. Yep, double check. Well, listen, we're going to get started. The subcommittee hearing will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. This briefing is an extension of several hearings we have had discussing climate change, focusing on the current and future economic impacts of global warming and the cost of inaction. And I'm going to defer any opening statement for myself, and I know when we spoke earlier in the holding area, I mentioned the fact that we would be hopefully trying to do a hearing. In fact, this is a briefing. We do have time for your opening statements. So what I would like to do is afford each of you the opportunity to do so. So let me introduce the four of you, and then we will move to you, Mr. Gomez. We have Alfredo Gomez, Director, National Resources and Environment Team, Government Accountability Office. Dave Jones, Senior Director for Environmental Risk at the Nature Conservancy, Institute for Economic Freedom, and the Heritage Foundation. Dr. Michael Greenstone, Milton Friedman Distinguished Service Professor in Economics, University of Chicago, and the Honorable Stephen Benjamin, Mayor, the City of Columbia, South Carolina. So with that, Director Gomez, you are now recognized to give an oral presentation of your testimony for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Chairman Ruda, I'm pleased to be here today to discuss our work on how to limit the federal government's fiscal exposure by better managing climate change risks. This is an area that has been on our high-risk list since February 2013. The cost of recent weather disasters have shown us the need for planning for climate change risks and for investing in resilience. My statement today discusses the potential economic effects of climate change in the U.S., several areas where the federal government faces fiscal exposure from climate change risks, and the extent to which the federal government has invested in resilience to these impacts. The potential economic effects of climate change could be significant and unevenly distributed across economic sectors and regions of the U.S. For example, the Southeast, Midwest, and Great Plains regions will likely experience greater combined economic effects, largely because of coastal property damage in the Southeast and changes in crop yields in the other two regions. While the estimates of these effects are imprecise due to modeling and information limitations, the estimates can help decision makers better manage climate risks. Early this year, we also reported that the federal government faces fiscal exposure from climate change risks in several areas, including disaster aid, federal insurance programs, and federal property and land. The rising number of natural disasters and related federal assistance are a key source of federal fiscal exposure. Since 2005, federal funding for disaster assistance is at least $450 billion. According to the U.S. Global Change Research Program, disaster costs are projected to increase as certain extreme weather events become more frequent and intense due to climate change. In addition, the National Flood Insurance Program and the Federal Crop Insurance Program are sources of federal fiscal exposure due in part to the vulnerability of the insured property and crops to climate change. From 2013 to 2017, losses paid under these programs totaled $51.3 billion. As of April of this year, the National Flood Insurance Program was $21 billion in debt to the Treasury. With regard to federal property, the government owns and operates hundreds of thousands of facilities, such as defense installations, and manages millions of acres of land that could be affected by climate change. For example, in September 2018, Hurricane Florence damaged Camp Lejeune and other Marine Corps facilities in North Carolina, resulting in a preliminary repair estimate of $3.6 billion. 1 month later, Hurricane Michael devastated Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida, resulting in a preliminary repair estimate of $3 billion. One way to reduce federal fiscal exposure is to reduce or eliminate long-term risk to people and property from natural hazards. For example, in September 2018, we reported that elevating homes and strengthening building codes prevented greater damages in Texas and Florida during the 2017 hurricane season. Congress also passed the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018, which enabled additional improvements at the state and local level. With regards to resilience, the federal government has made limited investments. However, it does not have a strategic approach for investing in climate resilience projects. No one is in charge when it comes to identifying and prioritizing climate resilience projects across the federal government. No federal entity is looking holistically at how to strategically prioritize projects to ensure they address the nation's most significant climate risks. In summary, the federal government could reduce its fiscal exposure to climate change by focusing and coordinating federal efforts. We have made a total of 62 recommendations, and as of December of last year, 25 of these recommendations remain open. Some of these identify key government-wide efforts needed to help plan for and manage climate risks and direct federal efforts toward common goals, such as improving resilience. And this completes my opening statement.
Thank you very much. Mr. Jones, you are recognized for 5 minutes for opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Dave Jones. I serve as the Senior Director for Environmental Risk with the Nature Conservancy, and from 2011 to 2018, I had the privilege of serving as California's Insurance Commissioner. Climate scientists have concluded that global temperature rise is contributing to catastrophic weather-related events. Sea level rise, hurricanes, heavy precipitation, coastal and river flooding, urban heat islands, drought and wildfires are all made more severe and more frequent by global temperature rise. These events are resulting in loss of life, injury, and destruction. And these events produce economic and insurance losses. And these losses are rising over time globally and in the United States. From 1980 to 2019, damages associated with extreme weather events causing $1 billion or more in damages have cost the U.S. economy $1.7 trillion. In 2017, global economic losses from natural catastrophes were $330 billion, and total global insured losses were nearly $138 billion, the highest losses in history. In the United States, insurance companies are responding to increased losses from severe weather events by raising premium prices and excluding or limiting coverage for certain risks when the risk of loss is too high. Flood insurance in the United States provides an important example of how private insurance companies may respond when they conclude the risk of loss is too high. Decades ago, home insurance companies in the U.S. concluded the risk of flooding to many homes was too high. Home insurance companies have since then excluded coverage for flood risk in all standard home insurance policies. Today, I'd like to focus my testimony on the threat of extreme wildfires as an example of a climate-driven peril facing insurers. The fourth National Climate Assessment stresses that fires are already increasing in intensity, duration, and frequency, and by mid-century, the western United States is expected to have 2 to 6 times more damaging wildfires. In 2017 and 2018, California suffered the most deadly, destructive, and largest wildfires in its history. 150 lives were lost, tens of thousands of homes and other structures were damaged or destroyed. In California alone, insurers suffered $12 billion in losses in 2017, only to be followed in 2018 by $13 billion in aggregate losses, the largest insured losses associated with wildfire ever. Home insurers have responded to the higher losses and greater risk of wildfires by raising prices for insurance and by declining to renew their existing insurance policies or declining to write new policies for homes the insurer concludes face too high a risk of wildfire. California is marching steadily toward an uninsurable future regarding insurance coverage for homes at risk of wildfires. So what can we do? Greenhouse gas emissions need to be reduced dramatically in order to address the underlying driver of catastrophic weather-related risks. One important, oftentimes overlooked way of doing so is natural climate solutions, which can provide up to 37% of carbon reductions needed to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. We need more public and private investment in these approaches as part of a broad effort to meet the Paris Agreement targets. And to further reduce the risk of wildfires, we need to address the needs of communities and ecosystems in an integrated fashion. Collaboration, strategic hazardous fuels reduction, innovation, and funding are the means to resilient landscapes and communities. Strategic, proactive hazardous fuel treatments have proven to be a safe and cost-effective way to reduce risk to communities and forests by removing overgrown brush and trees, leaving forests in a more resilient condition, resilient to wildfires. Funding for these and other programs to reduce wildfire risk is a continued challenge. The 2018 Fire Fix helped to stabilize the Forest Service and Department of Interior budgets. However, that effort must be coupled with federal reinvestment in restoration and risk reduction programs. Insurers can also play an important role by designing and offering insurance products that account for the risk reduction benefits of nature in their pricing and underwriting. Insurers could design and offer innovative insurance products in areas at risk of wildfires which take into account the risk reduction benefits of ecological management of forests. Home insurance pricing and availability in the face of increasing wildfire risk is but one example of how insurers may respond to increased risks associated with climate change. Hurricane risk, river and coastal flood risk, risk of prolonged droughts, urban heat islands, all of these are examples of climate-driven risks that can have consequences for the pricing and availability of insurance. While insurance and the insurance sector can play a role in helping to manage these risks, more fundamentally, it is the underlying drivers of these risks that need to be addressed. That means reducing greenhouse gas emissions dramatically, including using natural climate solutions. It also means using nature-based solutions to reduce or adapt to risk and build resilience. Otherwise, we'll find ourselves in an increasingly uninsurable world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Dr. Greenstone, you are recognized for 5 minutes of comments.
I am the Milton Friedman Professor in Economics and Director of the Becker-Friedman Institute and Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago. The social cost of carbon, or the SEC, is the cost to society of polluting an additional ton of CO2 in the atmosphere. The SEC enables regulators to account for potential benefits to society to lower carbon emissions and points toward the optimal price on carbon required to address greenhouse gas emissions. So first, let me give a little history. In 2009, while working in the Obama administration, I convened and co-led an interagency working group to determine a government-wide value for the social cost of carbon. As of 2016, the United States government estimated the social cost of carbon at about $50 per ton of CO2. Since its inception, the SEC has been used as a foundational tool in setting roughly 150 federal regulations that cover areas such as energy efficiency and fuel economy standards. To date, the benefits from U.S. regulations written to include the social cost of carbon total more than $1 trillion. However, there are several reasons the current administration's social cost of carbon is too low, and it, as a consequence, undermines the well-being of the American people. Let me list them. Number one, in 2018, the Trump administration instituted a smaller social cost of carbon of $1 to $7 compared to $50. It's based on two faulty assumptions. First, it uses inappropriately high discount rates that are not supported by economic theory or financial markets. Second, it fails to account for damages that occur outside the United States. This failure discourages other countries, who in total produce about 90% of total CO2 emissions, from undertaking emissions cuts that would benefit U.S. citizens. The United States' special role in global diplomacy can produce demonstrable benefits for U.S. citizens, and we are failing here. The absence of meaningful progress at the recent Madrid climate talks is evidence of what happens when we retreat. Number two, the social cost of carbon is no longer based on the frontier of scientific and economic understanding, as noted by a 2017 report issued by the National Academy of Sciences. To fill this hole, I'm started and co-leading something called the Climate Impact Lab, which is implementing the National Academy of Sciences recommendations to update the social cost of carbon. A primary Climate Impact Lab finding is that changes in mortality rates due to temperature changes alone will lead to a social cost of about $24 per metric ton of CO2. So let me put that in context. That $24, or mortality partial social cost of carbon we compute, is 10 times larger than what the Obama number had as the mortality cost. In fact, it's almost half of the entire mortality Obama estimate, and it is 3 to 20 times larger than the Trump administration's entire social cost of carbon. Number three, while estimating climate damages is subject to uncertainty associated with climate models and econometric estimation, this uncertainty actually strengthens the case for reducing emissions. Economics and casual observation reveal that people show a propensity towards risk aversion. My fellow witnesses' entire industry of insurance depends on the idea that people dislike risk. And in fact, they're willing to pay a premium to avoid uncertain outcomes. For this reason, the U.S. government's estimates of the social cost of carbon under all administrations, which fail to account for this risk aversion, is likely too low. So what to do? Given the scale of the climate challenge and the urgent need for resources to address other pressing societal challenges, it's critical that policy delivers the cheapest reductions in CO2 emissions both today and in the future. The surest way to achieve inexpensive reductions today is to price CO2 emissions with a carbon tax or by implementing a cap-and-trade program. If set at the right level, for example, pegged to social cost of carbon, these pricing approaches solve the main problem, which is that people and firms currently don't take account of the damages they cause by engaging in activities that release CO2. This approach's great appeal is that it unleashes market forces to uncover the least expensive way to reduce emissions. By incentivizing switches to cheap emissions reductions, families and businesses can reduce emissions and have money for other priorities. In contrast, current federal and state policy is really a hodgepodge that targets emissions in different sectors in different ways and with different degrees of intensity. A recent paper by some colleagues at Yale and Harvard concluded the range of costs of U.S. CO2 mitigation policies is extremely wide, from less than $10 per ton to over $1,000 per ton. And most of these costs are relative, and most of these emissions reductions are relatively expensive in the sense that they vastly exceed the U.S. government's 2017 social cost of carbon. So the point is we're getting unnecessarily small reductions of CO2 given the amount of money we're spending. In contrast, pricing carbon would prioritize activities with the highest bang for the buck. Let me finish quickly. Turning to future reductions, the private sector on its own will not invest enough in research, development, and demonstration to uncover new approaches to reducing CO2 because many of the returns of those investments would flow to their competitors. The fact that private firms lack incentives to engage in energy RD&D is a market failure, and the government can address this by providing subsidies or funding research directly. In conclusion, the United States needs to balance the cost to our economy of mitigating climate changes today, those are the costs we incur, with the climate damages that are coming. Carbon pricing that is pegged to a reformed social cost of carbon, using the best available evidence, along with robust RD&D funding, will deliver the inexpensive reductions in CO2 emissions that are necessary today and in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Greenstone. Mayor Benjamin, you are now recognized for 5 minutes of comments.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you and Ranking Member Comer and the members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify. Obviously, we have our condolences on the loss of our chairman, Representative Cummings, his son of South Carolina with South Carolina roots, and we all miss him a great deal. My name is Steve Benjamin. I have the pleasure of serving for the last 10 years as mayor of Columbia, South Carolina, a thriving, diverse city in the center of our great state. In addition to serving as our state government, we also host nearly 50,000 students attending the University of South Carolina, Columbia College, and two historically black colleges, Allen University and Benedict College. We're also the proud home to Fort Jackson, the Army's largest training center, which trains approximately 45,000 soldiers per year. Climate change is perhaps the biggest challenge we face. I'm pleased that the subcommittee is holding this hearing on the economic effects of climate change. I'm especially pleased that the subcommittee wants to hear about its impact on local government budgets and local economies. Mayors and cities throughout the country are already grappling with the impacts of climate change. Local governments are also leading the efforts to mitigate those impacts and make our communities more resilient, most notably hardening and modernizing our infrastructure. However, we can't tackle this alone. We need a strong federal partner. It's therefore our hope that this hearing will be the first step in the development of a robust national climate action program that recognizes and bolsters the efforts of mayors and cities that we're taking to address this existential challenge. In Columbia, we unfortunately witnessed firsthand how climate change is already impacting cities and testing our infrastructure. Over 3 days in October 2015, the remnants of Hurricane Joaquin stalled over central South Carolina, inundating the Carolinas with nearly 11 trillion gallons of rain, 30 inches of rain in our great city. The impact was dire, taking the lives of 19 precious South Carolinians. The storm nearly wiped out our Columbia Canal, which serves as our main drinking water treatment plant, ruptured dozens of water and sewer mains, closed over 100 streets, flooded one fire station and our primary fire training facility, and breached multiple dams and damaged nearly 400 homes and 60 businesses. Since then, we've had several other major rain events. Though Joaquin was a 500-year event, heavy rain events are apparently becoming the new normal. In the aftermath of Joaquin, it became clear to us that recovery, resilience, and mitigation against future storms would be costly and required detailed local knowledge of conditions on the ground and city infrastructure. Not only increased rainfall and more intense storms more frequent, but of course, New York Times report in 2018 showed that in 1969, Colombia would experience about 46 days per year of above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. By the time that was the year I was born, by the time I turned 80, we expect that to more than double. We see similar trends in Lake Elsinore, not far from your home, and certainly not far from Member Comer's hometown of Tompkinsville, a doubling also of the number of days above 90 degrees. This excessive heat, of course, has adverse impacts on everyone, but certainly the elderly, manual laborers, the impacts on food production, decreased air quality. Last year, through June of this year, I had the honor of representing my fellow mayors throughout the country as president of the United States Conference of Mayors, an official nonpartisan organization of cities with populations of 30,000 or more. At the national level, I also serve as chairman of the Municipal Bonds for America, a coalition dedicated to preserving the tax exemption of municipal bonds, as co-chair of the Sierra Club's Mayors for 100% Clean Energy, and as past president of the African American Mayors Association. I've been fortunate to do that at a time when mayors are taking a renewed prominence and role in the national stage, being at the forefront of public policy innovation. Our 2015 plugs were a call to action for Columbia. My written testimony outlines those in detail. They've been submitted for the record, but we've used Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grant to help save our citizens millions of dollars by updating our infrastructure. One of my first initiatives when I took office priorities was to upgrade our regional transportation system. We are moving forward significantly. 2 years ago, we took the next step of setting a target of powering our community with 100% clean renewable energy by 2035. In addition to our climate change prevention efforts, we've also been actively addressing mitigation. Last year, we made history by issuing our first ever green bonds to improve our stormwater system, the first tranche in a $95 million plan over the next 4 years to address our city's flooding and stormwater drainage issues. Local governments only collect about 15% of our nation's tax revenue. With that 15%, we're expected to deliver a significant array of core governmental services that we all understand make up the heart of a civilized society of the Western world. We know we cannot tackle that task of slowing climate change on our own. We need a strong federal-local partnership. The Conference of Mayors has issued a mayor's call for climate action that I've included as an attachment to my written testimony, so I won't go into in detail, but it lays out a significant number of proposals that we believe could be implemented and produce quick results, underscoring the existential threat that climate change climate change means to the world, and certainly the economic impact it has on our cities. We appreciate the opportunity to testify, and thank you for your work on this major generational challenge.
Thank you, Mayor, and thanks to all of you for participating today in this briefing. Let me emphasize, part of the reason you're here is that the Subcommittee on the Environment for Oversight Committee, we're very focused on the impact of climate change. In fact, this is the number one issue that we are trying to tackle this year and next year in the 116th Congress. In that process, we are looking at 3 phases of hearings, each phase having multiple hearings and briefings. And that is past, present, and future, as simple as that. Past, what did we know and when did we know it about climate change? We have already had hearings where testimony and evidence was provided showing that Shell and Exxon knew in the late 70s and early 80s about the impact of extensive burning of fossil fuels would have in CO2 emissions and the impact on the environment, as well as climate change and more severe weather events. In the present phase of these hearings and briefings, which we are in right now, our goal is to help the public as well as lawmakers understand both the economic and the human impact of climate change. Unfortunately, Mayor Benjamin, as you just pointed out, it's often quite easy to figure out the human impact of climate change. It is literally counting the number of people who have died from that event. We've also had testimony from others, though, in talking about the human impact from a health care cost, and that certainly is more difficult to ascertain. But also quite important that we get to that information. The other aspect is the economic impact of climate change. And That's what we're really here today to help the public better understand that climate change, more severe weather events, causes much greater damage and greater economic impact than we would experience without having climate change at our doorstep. And then we will move into the third phase of hearings, and that will be on the future. And quite literally, we will paint two different pictures, one nirvana and one apocalyptic, knowing that if we do nothing, what type of a world we will be leaving for our children, our grandchildren, and future generations. On the other hand, if we do take action now, how we can dramatically impact what our world will look like for future generations. Knowing also that even if we take dramatic action now, there's going to be impact from climate change that we can't stop immediately, that we are going to experience negative consequences for our past inaction. So you being here today is extremely helpful in allowing us to help educate the public and educate lawmakers, especially those on Capitol Hill, because it's certainly clear that the states and the mayors around our country have a better understanding of the impact of climate change and ways to address it. So let's dig into a few questions. And I'm going to bounce around here a little bit. And when we talk about the economic impact, Dr. Greenstone, let me start with you. You were talking a little bit about the social cost of carbon, and I'd like to try and pin you down a little bit, because I think from your comments that there's a wide range of estimates as to what the social impact is from carbon. And I'm curious, do you have a hard number as to, in current dollars, as to what the cost per ton should be?
So I think the best estimate that we have currently is the one from the leftover from the Obama administration, which is about $51 per ton. And so in plain English, or as best I can for this, what that means is that every time we emit a ton of CO2 in the atmosphere, we're giving the world as an unfortunate gift about $51 worth of damages. It's true that there's some variability around that number. But what's important to remember is that when things are uncertain, what people want to do is actually buy insurance against that. And so that would actually tend to increase how much we would want to spend to protect ourselves.
And the $51, just to be clear here, some of the things that would go into the calculation of that $51 per ton is shortened lifespans and health care costs due to air pollution, as an example. Is that correct?
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's several kind of big ticket categories. Human health is at the top of the list. And this new research that I was talking about, which I think will eventually cause us to want to revise social cost of carbon, says that we've been underestimating that. But yes, there will be large increases in mortality rates. People will have shorter and sicker lives as a consequence of the change in climate. There will be wide parts of the United States that are going to be subject to flooding and to storm surge, where I think we'll have to have populations basically move, and will involve very complicated and thorny political decisions about which parts of the United States we're going to protect and which ones we aren't. And it will also show up in crop yields.
Right.
Yeah.
And if I recall my bill number correctly, I believe it's House Bill 763 on the carbon tax, which I'm a co-sponsor of, which I'm sure you're familiar with, that proposed legislation of tax and dividend. And in your mind, from an economic standpoint, does that fee, if implemented, needs to be brought in progressively, or do we go straight to somewhere around a $50 fee?
I think there's the best estimate we have is $50, and so I think there's a good case for starting around there. I think the most important thing is getting it above zero, which it is right now. So fighting about the exact number is, I think, not critical, but one would want to end at a number that's close to social cost carbon. Sure. My projection is that as we learn more, the $50 is going to look a little small, and we might want to have some room for allowing it to increase to reflect that.
And the sense here is that the true cost of burning fossil fuels is underpriced by at least $50 in the social impact cost that occurs from it. Therefore, those who create and burn and use fossil fuels should pay the appropriate price associated therewith, which would also suggest a faster move by those same operators and manufacturers and companies that develop and implement this, that they would move faster towards green, clean industries and fuels, correct?
Mr. Chairman, there's very little innovation in response to no market.
Right.
And so until there's a price signal, I think we're just hoping for the best that in terms of innovation. And once there's a clear price signal, the American economy and American innovators are extraordinarily effective at responding to it, and I have little doubt that there'll be all kinds of new ideas that start flowing in and give us much less expensive than we even imagined reductions.
And so basically this is how capitalism is supposed to work.
Yes.
Good. And you also mentioned cap and trade. I just want to be clear here, you're not suggesting that they're mutually exclusive, that they could actually work in tandem, correct?
You could. I think probably the best case would be to choose one and go down that path.
Okay.
And I think a lot of that probably depends on what one wants to do with the revenues. And I think it can often be easier to direct the revenues in particular directions with the carbon tax.
Mr. Jones, with your many years as insurance commissioner for the state of California, let's take a few minutes and just talk about the economic impact on average citizens and homeowners as we experience, again, more severe weather events and the underlying insurance for homes, whether it's flood insurance, property insurance, so on. Can you talk and speak a little bit to what we can anticipate if we do not provide a greater check to climate change for homeowners across America?
Certainly. And I think it varies geographically, as Mr. Gomez pointed out, but there's no question that the price of home insurance in certain geographies for certain risks is going to go up to the extent that those risks are driven by climate change. You see this most acutely in California, where as recently as 2017, the most recent period for which we have data, there was a 50% on average difference in the price of home insurance in the high-risk fire areas versus those outside. That average masks, though, in some cases, homes paying 200, 300, 350% more for insurance if they're facing a high fire risk versus those that aren't. The California Department of Insurance has in front of it about 100 rate filings this year seeking increases in rates. In all likelihood, those will be approved because of the justification of the insurers vis-a-vis their extraordinary losses in 2018 and 2017. We're also seeing a availability problem as well. At some point, and this applies broadly to all insurance, if the risk is so extreme, there isn't a price that the insurer can accept in order to cover that risk. And we've seen that historically with flood insurance in this country, where some 50 years ago or so, home insurers decided that flood risk was too high, so they stopped writing flood risk, and so standard home policies don't have that. And you're seeing that now in California with regard to home insurance and wildfire risk, where we're seeing a significant uptick in non-renewals or not writing new home insurance. Anecdotally, we're hearing that that's beginning to have an effect in real estate markets in some of those areas. We don't have hard data on that yet, but there's an implication there. As the price goes up, it becomes increasingly difficult for those on fixed incomes and those on lower incomes to afford insurance. That has consequences for their ability to have insurance. That means that they may go without insurance, and so if a catastrophic event occurs, they have nothing to fall back on in order to help recover. So all of those are consequences of climate-driven risk that play out through the insurance sector.
And along those lines, Mr. Gomez, I was not long ago in Miami and saw firsthand in a neighborhood I was in where groundwater was coming up and causing flooding on an average sunny day. And the implications from flood insurance, from title insurance, from the marketability of these properties, you start to get a very good sense of what could occur in many municipal areas around the country. Can you speak a little bit to what the economic impact would be if we see a deterioration of the real estate market and the home ownership markets in many parts of our country?
Right, at least from the studies that we've looked at, there are some regions of the country, as you noted, the coastal regions are going to have high economic impacts, primarily due to flooding, sea level rise. So we are seeing that from the studies that are telling us that. And really, I think as Mayor Benjamin noted, it's really the cities, right? It's the local folks that are seeing the impacts because that's where it's taking place. From the federal perspective, you know, it's up to us to figure out how we can assist that, how we can provide assistance, whether it's through information, helping them interpret and translate the information that they can use to make better decisions, right? Whether it's to build a seawall higher, or improve the building codes and standards. So there's many opportunities where the federal government, and we've recommended many things that the federal government can do to help state and locals.
Let's take this a step further. What happens if, due to some of these events, much like we've seen in California with these wildfires where you have apocalyptic events and many people lose their homes, and we've seen insurance carriers go out of business because of their inability to pay the claims. Often the federal government acts as a backstop for those situations. Is there a concern that we may come to a day where there are so many cataclysmic events that the federal government won't be in a position or unwilling to be in a position to backstop those situations?
I mean, that's a good question. And again, GAO has many areas that we've placed on the high-risk list. Those are areas where we want to bring attention. And one of the areas, as we've been talking about, is the National Flood Insurance Program. It has its own high-risk designation, and it's essentially because that program and the crop insurance program were never really designed to generate enough revenues to pay for the expenses. You know, as I noted, the National Flood Insurance Program owes the Treasury $21 billion currently. I believe that Congress actually wrote off a similar amount recently. So yes, these are growing federal fiscal exposures that the federal government faces, and they're unsustainable.
Mayor Benjamin, I want to circle back to a couple comments from your narrative. One was, you talked about how you prepare for and plan for greater climate change related events. Help me understand that. I mean, what do you and your city council, assuming it's a city council, how do you budget and plan to address future climate change related events for your city?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With increased focus on resiliency and mitigation, we obviously we run a tight ship fiscally. We have finished the last 9 years of the budget surplus. We always have a balanced budget. We have clean books. We recognize that a smart investment in infrastructure that now becomes more expensive because we have to also invest in resiliency and mitigation, and obviously thinking about the long-term cost of defeasing that debt. No one pays cash straight up, even in this wonderful interest rate environment. All those costs have to be borne by our common taxpayers and ratepayers. We decided actually my council voted unanimously. We don't vote unanimously on a lot of things on this nearly $100 million investment in addressing the top 20 flooding areas in our city. But the constant investment over the last 6 years, we've invested about $750 million in water and sewer and stormwater infrastructure, protecting our silver environment, protecting our three rivers. But it's gotten that much more expensive as we build in the cost of resiliency and mitigation. We have had the opportunity, because of previous decisions made by the federal government, to mitigate some of those costs. I mentioned the Energy Conservation Block Grant. We think that that's obviously a significant opportunity that should be renewed. We believe strongly in the CDBG program, and the focus on targeted investments in climate resilient infrastructure is a smart move. And certainly one of the major challenges we face, I mentioned the role that the tax exemption on municipal bonds allows us to make these investments in infrastructure, particularly water, sewer, stormwater. Most of that investment, nearly, I think almost 98% of it, is borne by local governments, not by the state or federal government. We lost in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act the ability to advance refund our tax exempt debt. Getting that back someday is also the case. But now every single decision we've made post 2015 certainly includes an additional cost, that eventually will have to be borrowed into fees over a period of time, already affecting cash-strapped local governments that I will say that are also driving the American economic experiment. 92% of America's GDP is created in cities and metropolitan economies. So it'd be wonderful if we could find creative ways, all of them laid out in our statement in the plan from the Conference of Mayors, to repatriate some of those dollars back home to make smart investments in American infrastructure.
So suffice it to say, it would be helpful to have leadership from Washington, D.C., recognizing not just the impact and seriousness of climate change, but also working to pass infrastructure bills that can help local municipalities and states better address these issues.
Absolutely. The question you asked Mr. Gomez earlier, I think since 2005, the federal government spent $430 billion in disaster relief funding. If we had that type of investment on the front end, it'd be amazing what we could do to mitigate some of the damages to our homes, our businesses, and our families.
Dr. Greenstone, and any others can weigh in on this as well if you've got information. My understanding is that Wall Street is looking more and more at pricing in the impact of climate change into the pricing of bonds. And I'm curious if you have come across that type of information as well, because ultimately, as Mayor Benjamin talked a minute ago about the green bonds that his city has issued, if there is additional 25 basis points that have to be priced into bonds at the municipal level or whatever the pricing might dictate based on the geographical location, that's a cost that's ultimately passed on to the citizens of those areas. So, Dr. Greenstone, if you want to weigh in on that, Mr. Gomez, I wouldn't be surprised if you might have an opinion or two on that as well.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just start by saying climate change is here. We're not debating whether or not we should have climate change anymore. We now have it. And the impacts of unmitigated climate change are beginning to show up. The mayor was talking about the ways it impacts the function of the city, and you pointed to how it's starting to show up in financial markets. I think importantly, it's showing up in insurance rates, which Mr. Jones highlighted, and that's causing people to make different decisions. And now there has been a growing recognition on Wall Street, and it's beginning to show up in bond prices, and it will show up in a variety of other asset classes as well. But what I just want to, there's a big difference between the impact showing up versus policy that sends a clear signal, which would also affect markets, and that would affect markets in different ways. It would reduce the emissions that are occurring, whereas the prices that you're pointing to are all more sending signals for how people should adapt to climate change and just treating it as if it can't be changed. But sending a price signal through a cap and trade or a carbon tax would also affect financial markets and would be very, very powerful at reducing the amount of climate change we have.
Good. Mr. Gomez?
Sure. So I would agree with that. We are seeing that in the insurance sector, for example, lots of activity in that area. One of the things that I wanted to mention is a few years ago, our Comptroller General convened a forum of primarily private sector companies to come to GAO and talk about more on the adaptation side, but what were they doing to deal with the impacts of climate change, because it's real. And this was a variety of private sector companies. We had oil and gas companies, we had food and beverage, we had insurance companies, all talking about the kinds of things that they were doing because they were already seeing the impacts, whether it was oil and gas infrastructure along the coast, whether it was beverages companies figuring out where they were sourcing their materials from, and it was getting hotter, and so they weren't able to harvest some of the ingredients. So it was really to show how the private sector has been reacting to these impacts. And so that's what we showed in that report.
Mr. Jones?
The G20 Financial Stability Board in roughly 2016 concluded that climate change poses a systemic risk to the global financial system. It created the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD, led by the private sector, which issued a report in 2017 that set forth a series of recommendations with regard to what the real economy and the financial sector ought to do. Principally among those is disclosure. Both real economy firms as well as the financial sector firms ought to be disclosing risks. That's not happening sufficiently. Second, the TCFD recommended that the financial sector undertake stress testing and scenario analysis of its portfolios to test the robustness against physical and transition risks associated with climate change. That is not happening with sufficient uptake. Another challenge we have in the United States is that although a number of other international financial regulators, including central bank regulators like the Bank of England and others, are taking up these recommendations, the U.S. financial regulators are lagging behind. BlackRock issued a report in March or April this year. They undertook to look at three sectors: muni bonds, utilities, and commercial mortgage-backed securities. They drilled down to the asset level. They were able to ascertain the differences in physical risks of the assets underlying the securities in each of those sectors, and there was some wide variance. Say you're a utility on the coast versus a utility inland, and so the utility on the coast is facing extreme risk of flooding, the utility inland not so much. And yet the physical risks that those underlying physical assets faced were not borne out in any discernible price differentiation in each of those three sectors' securities. So that's a big problem. Certainly, the Nature Conservancy supports a carbon price, a carbon tax, or cap and trade as a mechanism to adopt that. But sadly, climate change is already baked into our system, given the degree of greenhouse gas emissions that have already accrued. Physical impacts are already occurring. And those impacts, the physical risks of those impacts, are not being borne out in price distinctions in financial markets, and that has to do with a lack of disclosure, a lack of uptake of analysis by the financial sector. The rating agencies, to their credit, are beginning to take on capacity to look at these physical impacts, but they've yet to mainstream their ESG ratings into core financial ratings. Currently, the SEC has cast a large cloud in doubt over whether mainstream financial filings should include reflection of these risks. I think that's a huge mistake. And then there's another set of risks that we haven't had a chance to talk about yet, which are transition risks, which are the risks associated with markets, technologies, and governments moving away from a fossil fuel-based economy towards one that is not, which is where we need to go dramatically. But that poses a risk for assets in those sectors of the economy that are largely greenhouse gas emitting, and that poses a risk for investors that are investing in those sectors. And that is another kind of risk that investors need to be looking at, and the insurance companies are principal investors in this regard, but banks lending into those sectors need to be looking at. And so we need to be doing a lot more with regard to these financial system risks than we're currently doing in this country, and that's a big area of exposure as well.
And while you have the microphone, allow me to ask you this question as well. There's been a few ongoing battles between the Trump administration and the state of California. One of those has been over CAFE standards, the tailpipe emissions, where California has had the ability to demand higher standards from auto manufacturers, which 13 other states and the country of Canada follow as well. And the administration is trying to overturn California's right, as well as those other states. And Canada certainly can make their own decision, but has looked to California for its leadership in this area. What is the impact for not just the people of those states, but literally across the country and the world with the increased pollution that we would be looking at if that is enacted?
So I think the impacts are negative and they're multiple. One impact is just more emissions generally occurring with the related health effects, but a sizable portion of what California is trying to accomplish through those standards is a significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the transport sector, which is one of the sectors that's one of the largest emitters. And so undercutting California's ability to administer a separate standard will have significant negative consequences on the battle against greenhouse gas emissions.
And, it's worth noting for the public, 40% of the imports of the United States that come in by ship come in through Los Angeles and Long Beach ports. 25% of our exports go out. So California certainly would like to continue to be able to monitor and set appropriate levels for emissions in our state, since those goods reach all 435 districts of the United States. Dr. Greenstone, you wanted to add a comment as well?
Yeah, it's only partially related, and I apologize if it's too far afield, but I think CAFE is actually a terrific example of what I think of as kind of the hodgepodge approach to regulating CO2. The textbook solution to this, which your bill reflects, would be to have an economy-wide price on carbon. And instead, we have these kind of sector-by-sector things that don't directly target carbon. They direct fuel efficiency. It's not the same thing as carbon. And in the case of CAFE, we're getting reductions of CO2 probably at the cost of $100 to $200 per ton. If instead we were able to rely on clear price signals, I think there's reductions of CO2 that are available for, let's call it $10 or $15 a ton. And so effectively, we're paying about, through things like CAFE, about 10 times what we would be able to pay for using a more direct mechanism.
Votes are about to be called. I will take this opportunity to ask all four of you, is there anything else you would like to add? Often in these hearings and briefings, you hear somebody else say something or a question gets asked that you're not able to respond to, and this is your chance to jump in and fill in any holes that you might have seen.
Thank you for your leadership. We look forward to continuing this conversation and helping push it along, Mr. Chairman.
I would just add one thing. I'm very well aware, I've been pushing carbon pricing, which your bill does. The politics of that are complicated, and one key hiccup in that is important concern about distributional issues and what will happen to low-income and middle-class families. And I just want to highlight, which I know you know very well from the nature of your bill, that the carbon tax creates revenue that can be directly refunded to consumers and can actually improve the standing of low-income and middle-class families. And so I think that, while often brought up, is not a true impediment.
That's the dividend portion of that legislation. Yeah, thank you. Mr. Jones.
We'd like to thank you for your leadership, Mr. Chairman, and thank the committee for holding this important series of hearings. We would urge you, as you have historically, to consider natural climate solutions as well as nature-based solutions to mitigating and adapting to the climate crisis. I'd urge you to consider delving into the potential risk to the financial system that we had a chance to talk about a little bit earlier. There is one bright spot amongst U.S. financial regulators, and that is the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, with the leadership of Commissioner Ross Benham, has established a subcommittee on climate risk that's going to be making a recommendation with regard to all U.S. financial regulators as to what steps they should be taking to try to address this risk. I think this would be a very interesting subject for your committee to take up. And finally, with regard to insurance is a very important mechanism to help manage risk and to help communities and families, individuals, and businesses recover from catastrophic events. But if we don't dramatically and quickly reduce the underlying driver of that risk, insurance is not going to solve this problem, and insurance is going to be increasingly unavailable. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Gomez.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. So GAO is always happy to assist Congress in its oversight responsibilities, and I want to thank you for bringing attention to our work and our reports. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, while we were not able to have an official hearing, I can't thank each of you enough for attending this briefing and providing your comments. At the end of this process of the additional hearings we will be having addressing climate change and laying out, as I mentioned earlier, one of two roads that we are faced with, our hope is to provide concrete recommendations as to how we can achieve a road that reduces the impact of climate change. What are the tools in the toolbox that we can pull out and effectively make a difference? Recognizing that there is no single tool that's going to be the panacea for addressing this issue, but it's going to take multiple tools to be able to accomplish the outcomes we desire. So your comments here today will be a part of that final report that we take forward. In addition, don't be surprised if we may call on you again to attend another hearing down the road, and we'd certainly hope that you would consider participating in doing so. Finally, along those lines as well, as we continue to understand the true economic and human impact of climate change, we also need to further understand what are those tools, what are the emerging technologies that can help us in our quest. And if you are aware of emerging technologies or economic tools, incentives that should be considered under the tax code in an effort to move us in the right direction, move our country in the right direction, please bring that to our committee's attention. With that, again, I appreciate all of you taking the time to come to Washington, D.C. to provide us with your knowledge in this very important briefing. And with that, this briefing is adjourned. Thank you.